When we approach slavery, for example, in Philemon, we're talking about slavery in the Greco-Roman world, and in particular in the Roman Empire. And it was a very different institution than it was in the 18th and 19th centuries in the transatlantic world and the West African chattel slave trade. It's also worth pointing out that slavery in the Old Testament, you find, for example, Israel is in bondage. I mean, the Old Testament talks a lot about slavery, and it's very clear that Israel is suffering in bondage in Egypt, in enslavement, and that it is a wicked and abusive system. One of the things that's most critical to point out is that the scriptures, for example, in Exodus 21, condemns the kidnapping and sale of people, just flat out. And the modern slave trade, the slave trade that took men and women from West Africa, kidnapped them, sold them, put them on ships and brought them on the Middle Passage to the British colonies and then to the United States and sold them like cattle, that is expressly forbidden by the Bible, which prohibits kidnapping and selling people. So we can have clear moral authority from the scriptures, not just the New Testament, but from the Old Testament, that makes it very clear that slavery as practiced in the modern world, the modern slave trade, was antithetical to biblical justice and righteousness. And so when we talk about slavery in the ancient world, there are a couple differences worth pointing out. One, slavery in the Roman Empire, for example, was often an economic agreement, an arrangement, that sometimes these were conquered peoples that were subordinated to the conquering people. It was not perpetual, is the other thing worth pointing out. So it didn't transcend generations. The children of slaves were not, by nature of what family they were born into, they were not predestined, so to speak, or doomed to themselves to be enslaved. There were opportunities for exiting enslaved status. It was an economic arrangement. Secondly, slaves in the Roman Empire were often incredibly well educated. So you find, for example, members of the upper class who were taught by slaves. They were their teachers. And that's in stark contrast with what we find in the modern slave trade, where slaves, for example, in the American South, were forbidden from learning to read. Because slave masters in the South understood that if you let slaves learn how to read, they might read their Bibles, and they might actually start to raise questions about liberty. And so there was a profound difference in that category too, in that respect, about slavery in the ancient world and in the modern world. And then third, and maybe most significantly, slavery in the ancient world, in the biblical world, was never racialized. When we talk about slavery in the modern world, this transatlantic kidnapping of men and women particularly from West Africa and their transport to North America, we're talking about a whole system that was predicated upon the idea that one group of people, based on perceived physical appearances and differences, that they are somehow suited for enslavement in ways that others are not. And the whole idea of race gets constructed and developed in that context in the 18th and 19th centuries, the idea of blackness and whiteness, that blackness is what qualifies someone for subordination to enslavement, and whiteness is what keeps one exempt from that subordination. That is a very modern idea. And so when we come to the conversation about slavery in the Bible, when we read Paul appealing in Philemon about Onesimus, we're not talking about slavery as it existed in, say, Kentucky or Mississippi or Alabama in the 19th century. We're talking about something that was an economic arrangement in the Roman Empire. And nonetheless, even for all those differences, when Paul writes to Philemon, he calls on Philemon to receive Onesimus back not as his slave, not as his servant, but as his brother in Philemon. And so Paul understands that when two men who previously had an economic arrangement, there was an employer and employee relationship, as soon as this one man now, Onesimus, has been converted, he's been brought into the family, into the household of God, his fundamental identity and relationship now with Philemon is going to be one of a brother, not an employee, not even a slave, but as a member of the household of God.